next episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. Okay, as per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode, commented, liked, and all that kind of stuff. So we're into the third week of the lockdown, and looking at yet another 3 weeks of this. So hopefully you're not gone too much stir crazy, and you're all keeping safe and well, and being entertained, and obviously that's what I'm here for today. And I think you'll probably agree that today is going to be a bit of an entertaining episode. Yes, as you can see from the title page, I'm looking at Glenfarclas. Probably this is the only time, the first time, and probably the last time I imagine I will be looking at Glenfarclas. For obvious reasons. As you well know, Glenfarclas adheres to the second Goodrum law of whisky, which basically states those distilleries that make traditional spirit, i.e. rough as hell, are therefore destined to fill their spirit into ex-sherry casks to mask the character. Yes, I know, I'm being a bit harsh, but anyway, why am I doing an episode on the show on Glenfarclas? Well, the honest answer is that at the tail end of last year, a good friend of mine gave me a sample, obviously as you can see, the tri-pack of the Glenfarclas whisky, and said, isn't it about time you re-evaluated it? And to be honest with you, it probably was. I forget how long it's been between tasting certainly the older age statements of Glenfarclas, because as it's a sherry monster, and I like balance. I go on and on and on and on about balance, and that is to me the key point of to me a really good whiskey is a balance between all the flavours, whether that's spirit and an American oak character, or sherry cask, or wine casks. I like the harmony of being able to taste all the components that sort of make up a whiskey. I don't want something that's completely one-dimensional, and that doesn't necessarily mean just sherry matured spirits. You go to OTT on the first fill bourbon, as we well know, you're going to do exactly the same thing. You're going to obliterate the character of your spirit. Now, one of the interesting things about Glenfarclas is that, unlike the distilleries, the other sherry monster producing distilleries, Dalmore, Macallan, Glengoyne, and so on and so forth, at least with those distilleries you will get to taste the spirit out of American oak, and you will be able to see what the character of the spirit is. Unlike Glenfarclas, of course, who don't, as far as I'm aware, do not fill at all into American oak casks. Yes, there have been independent bottlings that have been aged in American oak. Certainly, I know the Scotch Malt Whisky Society bottled a series of casks, I think, around about 2010, 2011, and I remember tasting one for that year's independent bottling challenge. And obviously the way that they did that was, I would imagine that they sent their own American oak casks to Glenfarclas and bought fresh fillings, and because as far as I'm aware that the distillery itself doesn't actually fill at all into American oak. So how are you going to actually figure out what the character of the spirit is like when you can't taste it out of American oak, or you don't have the opportunity to have purchased one of the independent bottlings that has been filled into American oak? Well, you have to start with the 10-year-old. Now, in my experience, the 10-year-old is either wholly, or should we say predominantly, aged in refill sherry casks. I mean, it stands to reason it's the sort of entry level, if you like, bottling. It's the cheapest bottling, and obviously to keep the costs of as low as possible, then you are going to be using refilled casks. Obviously the older age statements will tend to sort of show a greater degree of first fill oloroso, one would imagine, like most distilleries have a tendency to do. So is there a soupçon of distillery character in the 10-year-old that we can sort of go, right, can you get the thread? That is the question, I suppose. So I guess we will indeed find out. So not really a great deal else to say apart from let's go dancing with the devil. Right, okay, so it did take me a while to sort of get everything together for, or enough samples that would make an episode of the show. So we're going to kick off with the 10-year-old. All the distillery bottling, well, the 10-year-old is bottled at 40%, so obviously chill filtered, and I will say that I don't believe that Glenfarclas actually use caramel to colour their whiskies. I mean, you look at the colour of all of these, and there's a, you know, there's a sort of a similarity, I guess you would say, but it's a natural hue, and I certainly don't think that they use caramel. Second bottle we'll be looking at is the 15-year-old. Now this is bottled at 46%, so probably, like I said, non-chill filtered, I would imagine. I don't honestly know, but you would imagine that, you know, bottling at 46, they probably wouldn't do that. Then we're going to look at the 21-year-old. Now this is bottled at 43%. Now we have an interesting one. This is a Hunter Laing Old Malt Cask 21-year-old. Now I believe this was distilled in 1992, bottled around April 2014. Now I'm a little bit vague because I really can't find out any information at all. I mean, Whiskey Base doesn't seem to list this particular bottling, but I know it exists because it says so on the label. Look, you know, Glenfarclas. Now, again, another interesting point about the distillery is that Glenfarclas don't tend to sort of sell that many casks. I mean, they do sell them. There are, like as I was just saying, you know, Scotch Malt Whisky Society, for example, Signatory bottled a number of casks, although I think that was quite a number of years ago. And, you know, one or two other independents have indeed bottled casks of Glenfarclas, but it does seem to me that they are somewhat reluctant to sell casks. I would imagine that they, like a lot of distilleries, probably are more inclined to sell fresh fillings, either directly into your own casks or to theirs, I would imagine, because, you know, you're not having to dip into your aged stock. Anyway, so like I said, I believe this particular bottling was bottled sometime around April 2014, because my tasting notes come from May. And it's obviously, as per usual with the OMC bottlings, bottled at 50%, non-coloured and non-chill filtered, and yeah, there's not a great deal of it there. Anyway, next bottle we'll be looking at is the 25-year-old. This is bottled at 43%, and one imagines filtered. I must admit, I do find it very odd these days that sort of distilleries do seem to sort of bottle less than 46%, you know, and it doesn't really make a great deal of sense to me, certainly from a, well, anyway. And the final bottle we'll be looking at, unfortunately no peat. You know, it's the second week when I haven't done a peated malt, which, slipping, I'm going to have to do some fairly soon, aren't I? Anyway, so this is the 105 bottling. It is their cask strength bottling. It's bottled at 60%, and although it's never, as far as I'm aware, carried an age statement, it's always been assumed that the spirit is around about 8 years of age, and I suppose to sort of hit 60%, it's going to have to be probably no older than that, I would have thought, and probably in more likelihood a lot younger. But anyway, I think this is going to be an interesting tasting, and you know, just because I'm not the world's biggest fan of sherry matured whiskies doesn't mean that, yeah, I can't sort of give them a fair evaluation. So I'm hoping that is exactly what I'm going to do today, and I won't be going anyway. Let's kick off with the 10-year-old then, shall we? Right, okay, so let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Obviously sherry. Now, as I said at the sort of the introduction, my gut feeling is that there is predominantly or a fair amount of refill sherry in this particular bottling, because I'm getting some of that traditional, i.e. hard barley, industrial, spirity kind of notes. It's got some toffee, there's some raisins, dried grape, prune. I mean, it's okay. I mean, there is absolutely nothing wrong with it whatsoever. There's no sulphur, there's no stinkiness, and there have been the occasional. I mean, you know, if you are going to sort of like, you know, fill wholly into ex-sherry casks, it goes without saying that there's going to be the odd one or two blemished bottlings. But by and large, I must admit that they seem to limit those. I mean, or just basically, I've not tasted that many bottlings, so you know, I haven't come across too many of them. But so I suppose the nose is kind of, yeah, it's not soft and Macallan. It's not Dalmore. It has an edginess, I suppose, a roughness, a traditional character, and yeah, I suppose you can say it is what it is. Let's see what the power's like. Straightforward, sherried, so raisins, prune. A little bit of malt treacle coming through on the mid palate, so it starts to darken a little. It does kind of, the sherry kind of peters out a little bit towards the end, and you start to get the industrial hard spirit character coming through. I mean, to me, it's not. It has character. I mean, so okay, let's be honest. It has character. It's not completely one-dimensional. It's maybe not the character that I find myself drawn to. I must admit, I think it kind of lacks a little bit of sweetness. It's not particularly bitter, but it's quite hard on the finish. It's quite sort of industrial, and if there was a little bit more sweetness from the sherry, I think the balance might have been a little better. Certainly, I don't think it's a bad bottling. It's just sort of, it is what it is. So let's move on to the 15-year-old. Let's see what those gives us on this end, shall we? Right, now we are more in the herbal sherry character. It's more about the sherry casks. So I'm guessing a little bit more first fill Oloroso. There's some nice juicy notes. There's some raisins. There's a little bit of orange, a little bit of citrus, a little bit of oxidized fruit, but I'm not getting any of the hard spirit character. So we're now, in 5 years, we're now starting to sort of lose the distillery character, and this is where, you know, the sherry is really starting to kick in. A little bit of toasted oak, a little bit of sort of burnt wood. Again, no blemishes, very, very clean. Can't fault it on that, but we are, like I said, really sort of moving into the wood territory now. Let's see what the nose goes. Or I should have said, well, let's see what the palate's going to give us. And so, yeah, we're more in the wood territory again. Bitter chocolate, dried fruit, Oloroso herbal notes, quite bitter on the finish. And again, to me, there's a little bit of a lacking of sweetness here, which is quite surprising, really. In reality, basically the sweetness of the sherry kind of comes through right at the beginning, and then the wood kind of starts to kick in and really starts to bitter at the end. I mean, we're not talking sort of like, you know, mouth puckering bitterness, but we are talking a little bit too bitter. There's also quite a bit of tannin as well. There's a softness coming from the dried fruit. There's some maturity. There's some oxidation notes. I mean, you know, as a sherry matured whiskey, perfectly acceptable. But you know, like I said, there's no real distillery character coming through here at all. What we have got is essentially a 15-year-old sherried whiskey. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the 21. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end. Right, even more sherry character. A lot more first fill. It's also a little creamier as well. There's a nice softness. You're now getting into the sort of like the, where I would say, so basically the 10-year-old has got a bit of a roughness from the spirit character. The 15-year-old has got a bit of roughness and bitterness from the oak. Now we're starting to get arguably a slightly better balanced spirit on the nose. Insofar of the sherry character is obvious, but we're getting more oxidation notes, we're getting more maturity, we're getting the softness, the creaminess that's kind of coming with that. There's almost a sort of a slight vanillin, so you know, and of course, you know, you're going to get vanillins even, you know, from sherry casks. Again, yeah, there's no distillery character whatsoever. You know, it could be a 21-year-old really from anywhere. I mean, or maybe it's not quite as rough as, say, Glenrothes, but, you know, I would probably be hard pushed to sort of say, if I was tasting this blind, where it came from. I mean, there's an edginess to it again. I mean, it's, like I said, it certainly doesn't have the sort of the polished character that you would associate with maybe Dalmore and say Macallan, for argument's sake. There is still a sort of an edginess to it, but yeah, see what it passes like. Palate is pretty much like the nose. Yes, there's more wood character, more Oloroso, but there's also more maturity. It's got the softness with of oxidised fruits, and there's a little bit more creaminess as well to offset the bitterness. And it's got quite a juicy finish. In actual fact, it's quite pleasant, and for a 21-year-old sherry matured whiskey, again, it is pleasant. You know, there is, and I mean, it's, like I said, it's not maybe what I would go for. I mean, but there's some nice maturity there. There's a little of that sort of Armagnac-y kind of dried fruit, a little bit of sort of prune, walnut, raisin. You know, it is a pleasant sherried whiskey. It's not setting my pants on fire, it has to be said. It's not got the real wow factor, but you know what, I've so far, no, that's probably the one I'm most favouring. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Old Malt Cask 21. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Again, there's the creaminess that I found on the Distillery 21, but this is quite sweeter, in a more kind of sort of castery sugar kind of sweetness, icing sugar maybe. There's a little bit of almost kind of tequila-y sort of pulped white fruit, that kind of thing. Boiled sweets, there's definitely some boiled sweet notes. It's kind of like, you know, there's that kind of slight Toshin-y kind of boiled sweet note. There's a touch of butterscotch, spice. Well, so far this is the most complex nose, but again, you know, what we are talking about is the complexity of wood and maturation. There's no real noticeable distillery character. I mean, I would kind of guess that obviously that sort of pulped white fruit kind of notes are obviously spirit related, but it's not got the sort of the character of the spirit in the 10-year-old. Some of my spices, I mean, you know, again, clean, and if this is the sort of thing you like, then, you know, it is not bad bottling. See what the par's like. Less sweetness on the palate in actual fact. I'm getting quite a bit of industrial character. So yeah, but again, some pulped white fruit, a little bit of a little bit of bitter chocolate. There's a little sherry sweetness, a little dried fruit, a little bit of cocoa powder. It's a bit short. Again, the spirit does kind of come through towards the end of it, so you can argue it has balance. You can argue that it certainly has some spirit character along with the character of the sherry cask. But again, you know, would you know that was Glenfarclas? I mean, you would probably think, well, I don't think it's got the polish of you know who, but again, you know, this is always the thing with sherry matured spirit. You are in essence losing a certain amount of balance for the wood, and you know, it's okay. You know, can't complain about that. Right, okay, so let's move on to the 25. Let's see what those gives us on this end, shall we? It's quite reserved in actual fact. I mean, it's actually fairly floral. I'm getting sort of, you know, white fruits, violets, some lovely sort of mature oxidised fruit, but the sherry is quite subtle in actual fact. It's not sort of like a booming first fill, smack you in the head herbal Oloroso monster. I mean, it's obviously sherry, that is the focus of this particular bottling, but it's got a laid back kind of character, a bit of a relaxed character, less industrial. I'm not getting the rougher edges. There's coffee, walnut, bruised apple, well, baked apple maybe, a little bit of citrus, a little bit of almost kind of grapefruit, I suppose. Again, I mean, there's no distillery character. It is all about the mature sherry character, which is nice. Again, I mean, you know, it's just not an unpleasant whiskey. It's not a cheap whiskey either, it has to be said. And like I said, it's not that there is complexity elements in there. It's not just all sort of herbal Oloroso. There are, you know, there's oxidation character, no spirit character at all, really, no distillery character, but you know, again, it is what it is. So the pass on. Nice, wonderfully mellow, soft, juicy, dried fruits, sherry character, no real bitterness. It's got a softness, not too overtly sweet either. There's a little bit of citrus. I'm getting a touch of grapefruit. Good length, good balance between cask and maturity. Yeah, I mean, again, you know, if that is the sort of style of whiskey you like, that is not a bad whiskey. Again, like I said, I'm not getting any real distillery character. I'm just getting the wood character and the oxidation character. But you know, that's pretty much what I was Right, okay, so finishing off with the youngest bottling, the 105. Let's see what those gives us on this. Oh my word! I mean, that's got intensity. It has to be said. It's kind of, I suppose, the 10-year-old. Well, it's not even the 10-year-old. It's just kind of the sherry on steroid, really. I mean, it's not particularly. Well, there's a bit of herbalness, but it's not an overt herbal monster. It's astringent, grippy, tannic, alcoholic. There's a touch of green nuts. It's raw. There's absolutely no distillery character there whatsoever, apart from that maybe that slight rawness. I mean, I suppose in essence, I guess this is possibly the one I would be drawn to them. Well, I don't know. It's a toss-up between this because it's got that kind of, rawness of character, and it's basically a sort of not quite no holds barred Oloroso monster. It's still a sherry monster, and it sort of does exactly what it says on the tin. So it's kind of a toss-up between this and the 25-year-old, I suppose. I mean, that is really pretty intense, it has to be said. Let's see what the power's like. Not exactly what you would call soft. I mean, that is a bit of a brute, it has to be said. I mean, it's hard, it's kind of alcohol enhanced, it's sort of like, sherry dried fruits. It's not particularly herbal, it has to be said. It is just basically a younger version of the 10 with a little bit more intensity. It's pretty full on and sort of, let's put a little drop of water with it and see what that does to it. I mean, that is, yeah. See what those are like now. More like the 10 now, it has to be said. I mean, it's, I am getting a sort of that hardness of spirit character. I'm getting that rawness, that industrial, traditional note. I mean, that's a hard nose. I mean, that is, that's a sort of like a, it's just not a soft and squidgy and sort of like, gonna caress the nasal passages. It's kind of like, grabbing them and sort of yanking the hairs out. It's kind of, but it's got character, I suppose. Anyway, palate. That's still pretty hard, still pretty sort of industrial. Excuse me, having its revenge there, I think. It's quite bitter on the finish. There's a lot of tannins. So like I said, it has a sort of the feeling of obviously the 10-year-old, but a lot younger, a lot more raw. Possibly, as the French would say, a bit sauvage. And it is a sort of, should we say, uncompromising. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show up. Well, there you go. That's probably a one and done for episodes of the show on Glenfarclas, it has to be said. And, it's not because I don't like it, it's just because I think, as I've kind of proven, that sort of once you get beyond about sort of, 10 years old, you pretty much, there is no more distillery character. It's all about the sherry, and to me, that I don't find that sort of particularly interesting. I mean, the 10-year-old. I mean, at least if you taste the 10-year-old, you will get an idea of the distillery character. You will get an idea of why I kind of place this particular distillery in the sort of the mold, in and around sort of, I wouldn't quite go as far as saying it's a member of the Axis of Evil, because I don't think it makes that sort of dirtiness of spirit. but it's, it's in and around sort of Deanston, Dufftown, and all those other distilleries that produce a quite an industrial or traditional style of spirit, which to me, I find that it's an endurance rather than an enjoyment as far as I'm concerned. And at the end of the day, that's what whiskey is about. It's about enjoying it. And there are certain people that like it a bit rough and ready, and a bit dirty. And I'm not kind of one of them, if we're talking about other things, but when we're talking about whiskey, I prefer my whiskey with a bit more finesse, should we say. The 15-year-old, like I said, this is the point where we start to lose any real semblance of distillery character. I mean, yeah, it's okay. It's a 15-year-old sherry matured whiskey, and, if you like that kind of thing, then fine. The 21-year-old, we started to get into a little bit more creaminess, a bit more softness at this kind of point. But again, we're getting a little bit more obvious oxidation, a bit more obvious maturation character, but again, there's no distillery character. It really could come from anywhere. I suppose the old malt cask bottling, because it's a single cask, is kind of like a snapshot, and there's probably a little bit more complexity with regards to the wood and the spirit character that there isn't in the Distillery 21, because obviously that's a batch bottling, and so I suppose from a sort of like an interest in maturation, yeah, fine, absolutely no problem whatsoever. And then the 25-year-old, I mean, that's a lovely mature sherry matured whiskey, and it probably is the sort of one that I would opt to go for, but unfortunately my pockets are not deep enough to afford such luxuries, shall we say. But from a sort of a reviewing point of view, I think that is obviously the most interesting, but again, no character from the distillery. It's again all about the wood and the maturation. And I suppose for those sadistic ones amongst you, the 105 is probably the one that you would opt to go for. It has intensity, no doubt about that whatsoever. It has alcohol, it has grab you by the you-know-what. And it has a real raw roughness to it. I mean, traditional character. And, it is what it is at the end of the day. And I suppose the finishing point that I would like to make is that if all whiskies were all distilled exactly the same and all filled into American oak, it would be really dull. It would be boring. Everything would be the same. There would be homogeny. So to have distilleries that do things slightly differently, that use different casks and all that, all adds to the weird and wonderful wacky world of whiskey, there's basically something for everybody out there at the end of the day. So although I like to think that this has been a balanced review, and an honest opinion at the end of the day, like I always say, you find out for yourselves. Obviously take my opinions on board, and at least sort of either kind of sort of say, yep, you know what you're talking about, or no, you ain't got bloody clue. But always sort of make your own mind up about things at the end of the day, because it doesn't matter whose kind of reviews you look at, mine or other sort of people, they're just one person's opinion, and it's all about sort of going, okay, right, fine, and then sort of just figuring it out for yourself, whether you agree or disagree, and that kind of thing. So anyway, that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I think it's been really quite interesting, and like I said, it probably won't be repeated. Probably won't be repeated, I imagine, because I've just got so much other stuff that I want to, and this was an episode that I really wanted to do, to be fair, and I've done it. So I can tick that one off my bucket list, so to speak. Anyway, like I said, I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope this will, maybe you'll sort of go, yep, I'll have a look at Glenfarclas, or maybe not. But anyway, until next week, stay safe and good ramming.